They say grief changes people. What they don't tell you is how it reveals them, strips away the masks we wear, and shows who we really are underneath. I learned this lesson the hard way when my mother passed away last spring, leaving behind not just a lifetime of memories, but a house full of secrets that would tear our family apart. My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew my family. I was wrong. I remember the day everything changed with perfect clarity. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was sitting in my office at the architectural firm where I'd worked for the past decade, reviewing blueprints for a new sustainable housing project. The call came at 2:47 p.m. Mom's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, her voice shaking as she told me she'd found Mom unresponsive in her garden. I always check on her when I water my roses, Mrs. Henderson explained, trying to keep her voice steady. She was just lying there, Rebecca. The paramedics are here now. But she didn't need to finish the sentence. I already knew. Massive heart attack, they said later. Quick and painless, probably didn't even realize what was happening. Small mercies, I suppose, though nothing feels merciful when you're 35 and suddenly motherless. The next few days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, casseroles from well-meaning neighbors, and an endless stream of relatives offering condolences that felt more like obligations than comfort. My brother Marcus flew in from Chicago, his designer suit and carefully maintained beard a stark contrast to my disheveled appearance. "Little sis," he said, pulling me into a hug that felt more performative than comforting. "How are you holding up?" I wanted to tell him I wasn't holding up at all, that I felt like I was drowning in a sea of grief and paperwork and decisions that needed to be made. But Marcus had already moved on, his attention captured by the family photos lining Mom's hallway. "God, this place hasn't changed a bit," he mused, running his finger along a dusty frame. "Still stuck in the 90s. We should really think about updating it before we list it." The words took a moment to register through my grief-fogged brain. "List it? What are you talking about?" Marcus turned to me, his expression a careful blend of sympathy and practicality that I'd seen him perfect over years of closing business deals. "The house, Becca. We need to sell it. Mom wouldn't want it sitting empty, and honestly, the market in this area is hot right now. We could make a killing." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. This wasn't just any house. This was our childhood home. The place where Mom had raised us after Dad died when I was 12 and Marcus was 16. The garden she'd lovingly tended for decades, the kitchen where she'd taught me to bake, the living room where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays. "We can't sell it," I said finally, my voice stronger than I expected. "This is Mom's house." "Was Mom's house," Marcus corrected, his tone gentle but firm. "And now it's part of her estate, which means we need to make smart decisions about it." Actually, he paused, adjusting his tie in a way I recognized as his tell when he was about to say something he knew I wouldn't like. "Mom and I talked about this a few months ago. She agreed it would be best to sell after she was gone. Said she wanted me to handle it." Something about the way he said it set off warning bells in my head. Mom had never mentioned anything about selling the house to me, and we talked almost daily. In fact, just last week she'd been excitedly planning to convert the spare bedroom into an art studio. "When exactly did she say this?" I asked, watching his face carefully. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, you know how Mom was. Always planning ahead. Look, we don't have to decide anything right now. Let's just get through the funeral first." But he didn't drop it. Over the next few days, as relatives came and went and we sorted through the immediate aftermath of Mom's death, Marcus kept bringing up the house. Each time, he had a new reason why selling was the only logical choice. The maintenance would be too much. The property taxes were rising. The neighborhood was changing. The funeral was a small affair, just as Mom would have wanted. She was laid to rest next to Dad in the local cemetery under a maple tree that would turn brilliant red in the fall. I watched as they lowered her casket into the ground, feeling like part of my heart was being buried with her. Marcus stood beside me, one arm around his wife Claire's shoulders. She'd flown in the day before, all sleek blonde hair and designer black dress, looking more like she was heading to a business meeting than a funeral. I'd never quite warmed to Claire in the 3 years they'd been married, and something about her presence today felt off. Like she was watching a play rather than attending her mother-in-law's funeral. After the service, everyone gathered at Mom's house, our house, for the reception. I moved through the rooms in a daze, accepting hugs and condolences, watching as people filled their plates with funeral food and shared their favorite memories of Mom. It was while I was in the kitchen, trying to find space in the overcrowded refrigerator for another casserole, that I overheard the conversation that would change everything. "Are you sure about this?" Claire's voice, low and worried, drifted in from the back porch. "What if she won't sell?" "She'll sell." Marcus's voice was confident, assured. "She has to. Once the will is read and everything's official, she won't have a choice. Mom promised me this house years ago, and with the documentation I have." I froze, the casserole dish heavy in my hands. "Documentation? What documentation?" "But what about the security cameras?" Claire asked. "If she checks." "She won't," Marcus cut her off. "Becca never was very tech-savvy. Besides, who checks security footage after a death? Trust me, by this time next month, this place will be on the market, and we'll be looking at a very comfortable profit." The casserole slipped from my numb fingers, crashing to the floor in a spray of glass and pasta. The conversation outside stopped abruptly, and I heard footsteps hurrying away from the porch. As I knelt to clean up the mess, my hands shaking, one thought kept running through my mind. What had my brother done? Mom had installed a simple security system last year, after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a few cameras covering the front door, back porch, and garden. She'd given me the login information just in case, though I'd never had reason to use it. Until now. That night, after the last of the mourners had left and Marcus and Claire had retreated to their hotel, I sat in Mom's study with her laptop open in front of me. The security system's interface was basic but functional, with a calendar showing dates when motion was detected. I scrolled back to the day Mom died, my heart pounding. The garden camera had caught everything. Mom working in her beloved flower beds, the sudden way she clutched her chest, the terrible moment she collapsed. I forced myself to keep watching through tears as Mrs. Henderson discovered her, as the paramedics arrived too late. But it was the footage from 2 days earlier that made my blood run cold. The timestamp showed 2:15 p.m., when I would have been at work. Mom was in her garden again, but she wasn't alone. Marcus was there, his suit jacket discarded, his face red with anger as he gestured wildly. I turned up the volume, straining to hear through the slight static. "Can't keep putting this off, Mom. I need that money now, not whenever you decide to sell." Mom's voice was calm but firm. "This is my home, Marcus. I'm not selling it just so you can cover up your mistakes. If you need help, we can talk about a loan. But..." "A loan?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Do you have any idea how much trouble I'm in? The investors are breathing down my neck. If I don't come up with the money by the end of the month, then maybe you should have thought of that before you started gambling with other people's money." Mom shot back, and I gasped. I'd never heard her speak so sharply to either of us. Marcus stepped closer to her, his hands clenched into fists. "You don't understand. These aren't the kind of people you can just apologize to. They want their money back, and if I don't deliver..." He ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing on end. "Just sign the papers, Mom. Please. I've already got a buyer lined up. They'll let you stay here as long as you want, pay you rent even. It's a good deal." Mom straightened up, brushing dirt from her gardening gloves. "The answer is no, Marcus, and if you try to forge my signature again like you did on those loan documents last year, I'll have no choice but to go to the police." The color drained from Marcus's face. "You wouldn't." "Try me." Mom turned back to her flowers. "I love you, son, but I won't help you deceive people. Not anymore." Marcus stood there for a long moment, his expression darkening. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed off, leaving Mom alone in her garden. The footage ended there, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely close the laptop. My brother, my own brother, had been trying to pressure our mother into selling her home to cover up what sounded like serious financial crimes. And now, just 2 days later, she was dead. The implications made me feel sick. I stayed up all night, going through more footage, taking notes, saving copies to a secure cloud drive. By morning, I had a clear picture of what had been happening in the months leading up to Mom's death. Multiple heated arguments, Mom refusing to sign various documents, Marcus becoming increasingly desperate. But what should I do with this information? The timing of Mom's death could be coincidental, The medical examiner had ruled it natural causes after all. But the fact that Marcus was now trying to force a sale of the house, claiming Mom had wanted it. I was still sitting in Mom's study when the sun rose, casting long shadows across the desk where she used to pay her bills and write her letters. The same desk where, according to the security footage, she'd hidden something in a false bottom drawer just hours before her death. With trembling fingers, I felt along the edges of the drawer until I found the catch. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it and a USB drive. The letter inside would change everything I thought I knew about my family and set in motion a chain of events that would either tear us apart forever or force us to face the painful truth about who we really were. But that's where part one of my story ends. The worst and the best was yet to come. Part two. The letter trembled in my hands as I unfolded it, Mom's familiar handwriting bringing fresh tears to my eyes. The paper still smelled faintly of her favorite lavender hand cream. My dearest Rebecca, it began. If you're reading this, something has happened to me and you found my hiding place. I hope I'm wrong about what I fear is coming, but a mother's instinct is rarely wrong, and I've seen the darkness growing in your brother's eyes. I had to pause, take a deep breath, steady myself before continuing. The USB drive contains everything. Bank statements, emails, recorded conversations, the evidence of what Marcus has been doing with his investment firm. He's been running a Ponzi scheme, Rebecca, using new investors' money to pay off the old ones while pocketing millions for himself. When I discovered this 6 months ago, I confronted him, tried to convince him to turn himself in. He begged me to help him cover it up. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. This couldn't be real. Marcus, my brilliant, successful older brother, a criminal? I refused. Mom's letter continued. I thought if I stood firm, he would do the right thing. Instead, he became desperate. He tried to forge my signature on documents to sell the house, thinking he could use the money to pay off some of his investors. When I caught him, I threatened to go to the authorities. That's when the threats started. Coffee. I needed coffee, or something stronger. I set the letter down and walked to Mom's liquor cabinet, poured myself a finger of the bourbon she kept for special occasions. The burn of it helped steady my nerves as I returned to the letter. I'm not telling you this to turn you against your brother, sweetheart. I'm telling you because someone needs to know the truth. The USB drive contains copies of everything I've gathered, including the forged documents. There's also a video of me, recorded yesterday, explaining everything in detail. I've sent copies to my lawyer, Jeffrey Martinez, with instructions to turn them over to the authorities if anything happens to me. The bourbon threatened to come back up. Yesterday. She'd recorded a video yesterday, hours before her heart attack. If you're reading this, you've already seen the security footage. You know how volatile Marcus has become. I don't know what will happen next, but I need you to be careful, Rebecca. Your brother isn't the man we thought he was. The letter ended with instructions for contacting her lawyer and accessing a safety deposit box at the local bank. I sat there for a long time, holding the paper, trying to make sense of it all. The sun had fully risen by the time I plugged the USB drive into Mom's laptop. The video loaded immediately. Mom sitting in this very study, looking tired but determined. Hello, Rebecca, she said, and fresh tears spilled down my cheeks at the sound of her voice. I'm recording this because I'm afraid. Your brother came to see me again today. He was different, desperate in a way I've never seen before. He said his investors are demanding their money back, threatening to go to the authorities. He wanted me to sign papers transferring the house to him immediately. She paused, rubbing her temples. I refused, of course. Told him I'd rather go to the police myself than help him deceive more people. He didn't take it well. The look in his eyes. She shuddered. I've never been afraid of my own son before today. The video continued for another 20 minutes as Mom detailed everything she discovered about Marcus's scheme. The amounts were staggering, over $15 million stolen from investors, many of them retirees who trusted my brother with their life savings. I was still staring at the blank screen after the video ended when my phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, meeting with the estate lawyer at 10. Don't be late. I checked the time, 8:47 a.m. Just enough time to make a few calls of my own. The law office of Martinez and Associates occupied the entire 10th floor of a downtown office building. I arrived early, clutching my oversized bag containing Mom's laptop, the USB drive, and copies of everything I'd found. Marcus and Claire were already there, him pacing the conference room while she tapped away on her phone. Finally, Marcus said when I walked in, "Where have you been?" "I've been calling all morning." I hadn't answered any of his calls. I'd been too busy talking to Mom's lawyer, Jeffrey Martinez, and showing him everything I'd found. He'd listened gravely, made copies of everything, and then made some calls of his own. "Sorry," I said, taking a seat across from them. "Had some things to take care of." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door opened and Jeffrey Martinez walked in. Following him were two men in dark suits who definitely weren't lawyers. "Marcus Mitchell," one of them said, pulling out a badge. "I'm Agent Roberts with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We need to ask you some questions about Mitchell Investment Partners." The color drained from Marcus's face. His eyes darted to me, then to the door. But the second agent was already moving to block it. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "We're here for a will reading. My mother just died." "Yes," I said quietly. "She did. 2 days after threatening to expose your Ponzi scheme." "You," Marcus turned to me, his face contorting with rage. "What did you do?" "She didn't do anything," Jeffrey Martinez said, laying a folder on the conference table. "Your mother did. She came to me months ago with concerns about your activities. Asked me to hold on to some very interesting documentation. When she died so suddenly after your confrontation in the garden, well," he shrugged, "she left very specific instructions about what to do with that information." "The garden," Marcus whispered. Then his eyes widened. "The cameras. You saw everything," I confirmed. "Every threat, every attempt to force her to sign over the house. Right up until her last day." Claire was on her feet now, backing away from Marcus. "You told me she died of natural causes," she said, her voice shaking. "You said the house was supposed to be yours, that she promised." "Sit down, Mrs. Mitchell," Agent Roberts said firmly. "We have some questions for you as well." What followed was a blur of activity. Marcus and Claire were taken in for questioning. Search warrants were executed at their home and offices. By nightfall, the story was breaking on local news. Prominent investment banker arrested for running massive Ponzi scheme. Possible connection to mother's sudden death being investigated. The medical examiner would later revise Mom's cause of death. While she did have a heart attack, toxicology reports showed elevated levels of a particular medication in her system. Medication she wasn't prescribed, but that Marcus had access to through Claire, who worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Faced with the possibility of additional charges, Claire turned state's evidence against my brother. She testified about how he'd been planning to gain control of Mom's house for months, how he talked about taking care of the problem after their last confrontation. Marcus maintained his innocence in Mom's death, but the financial crimes were irrefutable. He eventually accepted a plea deal, 25 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, and full restitution to his victims. I was there at his sentencing, watching as my brother was led away in handcuffs. He looked old suddenly, defeated, nothing like the confident businessman who'd swooped in after Mom's death talking about selling her house. "Why?" I asked him before they took him away. "How could you do this to those people? To Mom?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, regret, shame. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold calculation I'd seen in the security footage. "Someone had to be the successful one," he said finally. "The golden child. That's what Mom always wanted, wasn't it?" They led him away before I could respond, before I could tell him how wrong he was. Mom had never wanted a golden child. She'd wanted her children to be honest, kind, worthy of the love she'd given us. Only one of us had understood that. A year has passed since then. I still live in Mom's house, my house now. I've turned the spare bedroom into that art studio she always wanted, filled it with her unfinished paintings and my own attempts at watercolors. She was teaching me before, well before. The garden is blooming again, though I'm not nearly the gardener she was. Mrs. Henderson helps, showing me which plants need what care, telling me stories about Mom as we work. Sometimes when I'm out there in the early morning light, I can almost feel Mom's presence, smell her lavender hand cream. The security cameras are still up, though I've thought about taking them down. In the end, I decided to leave them. They're part of the story now, part of how the truth came out. Sometimes the truth hurts, tears families apart, shatters illusions we've held onto for years. But sometimes the truth sets us free. Yesterday, I received a letter from one of Marcus's former clients, an elderly woman who'd lost her retirement savings to his scheme. The restitution payments have begun, she wrote, thanks to the seized assets and Mom's evidence. She wanted to thank me, to thank Mom for bringing the truth to light. I took the letter out to the garden and read it aloud to Mom's favorite rosebush. I like to think she heard it, that she knows her final act of courage helped bring justice to those who'd been wronged. They say grief changes people, shows us who we really are. Mom's death showed me who my brother really was, yes. But it also showed me who I am. Someone who, like her, will stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. That's her real legacy, and I carry it with pride.